All right, everybody. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about Reconstruction, the reconstruction of the United States after the Civil War. So let's get started. So first of all, let's remember that there were some lessons from the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, we see a South that is just totally devastated. The South has been destroyed economically, but also politically, socially, culturally. The days of the planters' aristocracy seem to be over. And this, a lot of folks are considering to be the supreme test of American democracy. Will the nation survive? Will American democracy survive? After the war, will we be able to put the country back together? Now, the Civil War seems to have answered some lingering questions about, compact versus contract theory, states' rights, federal power, nullification, and secession. Right? We now live in a nation in the post-Civil War era where we say the United States is, rather than the United States are, signifying and recognizing the supremacy of the national government, right? That the national government has a place of rightful leadership and supremacy in the United States. Okay, that's not to say that there aren't states' rights, but these theories that had viewed the states as sovereign are really no longer given much room to breathe in the post-Civil War era. The Civil War seems to have answered that question. All right. So emancipation. Let's remember that the emancipation is of the Southern slaves is a long and confusing process. Right. There's a lot of slaves who are not freed for years after the 13th Amendment. If you recall, the Emancipation Proclamation really only allowed soldiers to free slaves who were on Southern plantations in states that were supporting the insurrection. So a lot of slaves remained slaves throughout the Civil War and after the Civil War, even after the passage of the 13th Amendment. In fact, the Juneteenth celebration is a celebration of the final end of slavery and the liberation of slaves in Texas. Right? But it's a long, confusing process. There's people who are fighting emancipation, fighting against these requirements to free their slaves. Some slaves are going to remain loyal to their masters. You're going to have, you can imagine, if you were an older slave who had not known any other life, that it would have been terrifying to be thrown out of, what you deemed to maybe be a safe place, right? A known entity. I think of people, who do long prison sentences and have a hard time adjusting to freedom, right? On the flip side of that coin, there's tons of slaves who are just ecstatic to be free and exercise their freedom in very visible ways, right? And that's going to create some tension in the South as well. There's going to be those who, to the extreme, will exercise violence upon their former masters. So trying to imagine, it's an impossible task, but imagine how you would have responded to emancipation as a newly freed slave. And I think you could see that there would be a wide variety of responses. There'd be just as many individual responses as there were individuals who were being free. And we need to remember that, right? Okay, so freedom, what trends did we see? Well, we did see Black communities staying together. One group of Blacks known as the Exodusters were groups of whole Black communities that moved out west, moved out to Kansas. We recognize at the time that the church seems to be the backbone of the Black community, and it will be for a long time after that. But there are definitely educational needs. If you recall, the Southern states often had laws in place that prohibited masters from allowing their slaves to learn to read and write, to become educated. That was seen as a threat. And also political needs, right? They need representation and they need leaders from within their community to better represent them. Okay, so freedom comes with some challenges. All right. One of the things that the federal government does to try and address some of these challenges is they create an executive bureaucracy called the Freedmen's Bureau. And it's basically a welfare agency providing the basic needs and necessities to the former slaves who were known as freedmen. A lot of slaves took freedmen as their last name. They had been given the last name of their slave master. They no longer wanted that name, so they often would change their name to things like freedmen. So the Freedmen's Bureau will provide not just food, shelter, and clothing, but also education. This is going to be one of the biggest gains in the Reconstruction era, as the Freedmen's Bureau is going to teach, hundreds of thousands of former slaves to read and to write. But there's going to be immediate Southern resistance. Ending slavery is one thing, but challenging white supremacy is another. And so ultimately, there's going to be a lot of pressure from the southern states to get rid of this bureau. It's seen as a corrupt bureau. The southern perspective is here you've got all these northerners coming down to the south telling us how to live our lives and how to treat our Negroes, right? And so there's going to be a lot of tension over the Freedmen's Bureau, and ultimately President Johnson's going to veto the Freedmen's Bureau, which kind of belies some of his views about white supremacy at the time as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about President Johnson. And in my next lecture, I'm going to talk about his impeachment. He will be the first American president to be impeached. But Johnson was a Democrat, and he ran on a ticket with Abraham Lincoln, who obviously was a Republican, and he had never gone to school. He was a slave owner prior to the Civil War. He was really opposed to secession. He wasn't kind of the upper crust planter aristocracy type. He was more, I think, Andrew Jackson, rags to riches kind of stuff. He did not secede with Tennessee, and he is selected as a vice presidential candidate by Lincoln to appeal to the pro-Southern Democrats who are still part of the Union. He just happens to be the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He doesn't have the skills that are necessary to guide the country through Reconstruction. But nobody at the time thought he would need those skills because we all thought that Lincoln would be doing it, right? And we'll get to Lincoln's assassination in a bit. But Lincoln had provided leadership that got the country through the war. We figured that Lincoln would provide the leadership in his second term to get the country through Reconstruction. So the radical Republicans in Congress are those who are going to take a really progressive and radical view and call for equal rights, voting rights, all of these things that at the time were considered very radical. Lincoln is going to argue for a more moderate Reconstruction plan. He says, look, the first goal is to get the country back together, and then we can work out some of those next plans about, expanding rights and protections to the former slaves. The Southerners like this idea because then they get a say in how the rest of Reconstruction works out. They want that kind of moderate plan so that they can have a voice in the future. The radical Republicans, just the opposite. Before we let those countries back in, let's establish the kind of equality and freedom and resources for these former slaves that they're never going to support. All right. So Lincoln has this moderate approach. It's called a 10% plan. He says 10% of Southern voters must take a loyalty oath and pledge to abide by by the emancipation of the slaves and form a new state government. Right. You got to create a new constitution that does not have slavery. This is Lincoln's plan. The congressional response is the radical Wade Davis bill, which says, no, 50%. You got to get 50% of Southerners to take an oath to abide by emancipation. Basically, we're really concerned here that they're not actually going to free their slaves. And so the radical Republicans want to make sure that's what's going to happen. So I want you to think about it, right? These are the two sides. You got the moderate Republicans and the radical Republicans. And the moderate Republicans are saying, no, let's just get the country back together. Let's start healing. And then you have the radical Republicans who say, no, we need to make some major changes to the way that our country deals with these former slaves and equality and justice and all those sorts of things, right? And so, just a contemporary connection, you might see that the Democratic Party had this same debate in their primary system. Do we go with a really progressive and aggressive agenda, or do we go with a more moderate agenda and just kind of heal the nation that's deeply divided, right? And we all know which direction the Democrats chose when they chose Joe Biden. They chose a more moderate kind of healing direction is what it seemed like from the Democratic Party. Okay, but the Wade Davis bill reveals that the president and Congress are at odds, and we're entering a period now where we're going to see Congress is really going to have a lot more power and authority than the president. Okay, the main reason that the radical Republicans are the main point that they're disagreeing on is that the radical Republicans really want to punish the South for the Civil War, whereas the moderates just really want to restore the Union, right? In addition to that, that's a little simple. In addition to that, the radical Republicans really are people who believe in a more radical form of equality, and they want to see that be the future, not just in the northern states, but in the United States, all of the United States. Okay, so Lincoln gets assassinated. You know the story. John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater shoots him in the back of the head, jumps down on stage, says, "Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants," and runs out. And the nation is in shock. Lincoln dies within a day. And all of a sudden, that leader that we thought was going to guide us through Reconstruction is gone. And what we're left with is Andrew Johnson, the Tailor of the Potomac, right? And he's not well equipped in leadership skills or in political capital to get the job done. Congress thought that Johnson would pretty much do whatever they said, but Congress was wrong. Johnson really thought that that Lincoln was on the right track with a more moderate plan of Reconstruction. So Johnson came up with his own plan, said 10% take the loyalty oath. We're going to disfranchise the leaders of the Confederacy. So if you were a leader in the Confederate government, you don't get to vote now. You've lost your voting rights. And the states need to do two things. They need to ratify the 13th Amendment, ending slavery officially in the Constitution, and they need to repeal acts of secession, right? And Johnson ultimately is going to veto a lot of these Southern leaders anyway. So this is really frustrating to Congress, is that he's saying, okay, we're going to disfranchise them, but then they come to him and they grovel. And this, remember, he was on the outside and they were on the inside. They were kind of the elites, and he wasn't necessarily part of that group. And he just loves having them grovel, and he's going to end up granting a lot of pardons. And so this is going to lead to the Southern aristocracy being reestablished. These people are going to have political rights, and they're going to have voice and say in the future of their government, and they're going to do everything they can to restore the government as it was prior to the Civil War. One of the ways that the Southern states are going to do this is through something called black codes. Black codes. The states are going to make laws that now they can't have slavery, but how do they ensure that the black Southerners are a permanent, subservient labor force, right? They want to enshrine white supremacy, and they want to secure a cheap and reliable labor source. Those are kind of the two goals of these new, what we would call redeemer governments, right? Trying to redeem the South and restore the lost South, right? So what did they do? Well, they created a system that looked a lot like slavery. Instead of slave catchers, there were Negro catchers. They created labor contracts that black workers would have to sign in front of a judge that would determine the term and the all of the terms, length of term, and the conditions of their employment. And really, these labor contracts were pretty crazy. You can find some of these online still, some copies of these labor contracts where you're committing to a term of service. And most of them, if you were under 18, in most states, it would allow for whipping, right? You could be whipped as an employee. There were forced apprenticeships where young children could be taken from their black parents and given to new masters who would raise them as apprentices. But these labor contracts basically restored the institution of slavery in the South, right? The payment that they were making in terms of wages to the slaves was oftentimes less than a slave would have cost at the time. The labor contracts usually also required that the servants live on the premises and work 6 days a week from sun up to sundown, right? Those are some pretty typical terms. These states are going to pass black codes that restrict civil rights of the freedmen, right? They're not going to be allowed to vote. They're not going to be allowed to serve on a jury. They will be arrested for idleness. These are vagrancy laws. If you don't have a job, then you can be arrested, and then you have to pay a huge fine, or somebody can pay your fine for you and you work it off, right? So it sounds a lot like slavery or indentured servitude. And that's exactly the goal here of these Southern states, is to restore the Southern aristocracy, maintain white supremacy, and establish a cheap, permanent labor source, right? Get all of those things back that they feel they've lost with the end of slavery. All right, so Johnson and Congress are going to be at odds. Congress, led by radical Republicans, sees what's going on in the South and says, we need to take drastic action. Johnson says, no, we don't. Johnson is going to constantly veto the acts of Congress, of the radical Republicans, and eventually they are going to be able to override his veto. But things like civil rights bills, right? Johnson will veto this civil rights bill. Congress will pass a law saying that black freedmen have to be given civil rights in the South. Johnson vetoes, they override. Eventually, Congress is going to say, let's just get this stuff in the Constitution. And so they'll pass the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. 14th Amendment will guarantee citizenship rights to former slaves, equal protection of the laws, non-discrimination. 15th Amendment grants voting rights to men, black men. So regardless of race or ethnicity or previous condition of servitude, you can vote according to the 15th Amendment. So these are things that are going to be now enshrined in the United States Constitution. There's 3 Civil War amendments, the 13th, which gets rid of slavery, 14th, again, provides equal protection of the laws, 15th guarantees black men the right to vote. Right? Johnson is frustrated with Congress. There's a midterm election in 1866, and he says, I'm going to go speak out and get these radical Republicans out of Congress. This is a major backfire. He travels around and gives speeches. He's not great at giving speeches. He gets baited into arguments with hecklers in the crowd, and this actually backfires, and Republicans secure a veto-proof majority in both houses. So they're going to be able to override all of the president's vetoes. They basically don't need the president anymore, right? Okay, the Reconstruction Act of 1867 is what they come up with. We call this radical Reconstruction or military Reconstruction. Congress, now that they have this veto-proof majority, again, doesn't need President Johnson to sign any of their bills because they can just override his veto. So they have total control over Reconstruction, and this is what they go with. 1, you got to ratify the 14th Amendment, so civil rights and citizenship rights to all of the freedmen. 2, you've got to allow freedmen the franchise. You got to give them the right to vote in your state. Later, that will be done by the 15th Amendment, so we won't rely on the states to change their state laws. And then 3rd, there's going to be a federal occupation of the South. The Union Army is going to go back into the South. They're going to set up 5 military zones in the South and enforce the terms of the Reconstruction Act of 1867 with the United States Army, right? You can imagine how the South is going to feel about this, a new occupation, right? So again, the Civil War is not over. The fighting may have stopped, but the war isn't over. Think about what's going to happen, because this is going to come later. Mr. McCarty is going to talk about this. When the federal troops leave the South, that's the only reason that the southern states are adhering to the guidelines and requirements of the Reconstruction Act of 1867. What's going to happen if the military ever leaves the South? All right. Okay, the 15th Amendment. Congress didn't trust, ultimately is not going to trust the southern states to guarantee the right to vote. So they're going to propose and pass the 15th Amendment. And what we see once we start to see blacks in the South voting is we see black representatives getting elected at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level. And we see in this period of Reconstruction, from the time of the 15th Amendment until the end of Reconstruction in 1877, we see more black senators than we do from the end of Reconstruction to present, right? It's crazy. But when you start to look at how many black representatives were elected while the federal government was kind of protecting voting rights of blacks, it's a significant number. And then once Reconstruction is over, once the military pulls out and the southern states are left to their own devices, we're going to see this long period of no black leaders getting elected in the South, and the southern states, or from the southern states. And that's primarily where those voters are. All right. Okay. We're going to talk about this maybe a little bit, but I like looking at these symbols. We're going to see that the symbols, and this is a point of debate and contention today, right? We're going to see that these symbols of the Confederacy manifest during Reconstruction in the flags and constitutions and state mottos of the newly reconstructed states. So nearly all of the southern states are going to have a nod to the Confederacy in their new flag. And that flag at the top, that's what's called the Stars and Bars. That was the flag of the Confederacy. Below that is the battle flag of the Confederacy. So what we call the Confederate flag today was not the official flag of the Confederate States of America, but really the battle flag of the Confederacy. And so those in the South who are arguing that the lost cause of the South, that the South was really just fighting for all of the right things, are going to continue to fly that battle flag, right? And it gets a lot of folks asking, particularly Black Americans, who won the war here? Radical Republicans. Who won the war? By the time Reconstruction ends, it's going to be clear that the southern states are in some ways going to actually have more power than they did before the war. All right. Okay. So stay tuned. You're going to learn more about the end of Reconstruction from McCarty's lecture. My next video is Johnson's impeachment. So take a look at that. And thanks for watching.